Good evening. Thank you, Lisa, for that lovely introduction. And thanks to Rainy Day Books for co-sponsoring this event. I want to also thank Eric Ward, VP for Public Programs, for including me in the fall lineup. John Ratliff, VP for Communications, for doing a very good job of getting the word out that I'm giving this talk this evening. And to my colleagues from the Linda Hall Library, it's been such a pleasure. Thanks to all who are here and the ones who aren't, and the ones who are here are having either a long day or they've come back, and I appreciate it. And last but certainly not least, thanks to all of you for coming out. I'm thrilled to be here and honored to talk about my book. So it's my great pleasure to talk about a project I've been working on for a long time. The Dancing Bees, Karl von Frisch, and the discovery of the Honeybee language came out in May with University of Chicago Press. And actually, when I came here in January, I was just doing the final edits on the page proofs. And this is a project I've been working on for more than 10 years. So I've been staring at a computer screen, printing it out and doing edits. And now in January, I finally got a document that actually looked like a book. Like the fonts were in place, the images were there were captions. So that's what I was doing right as I got here. So it's really lovely to speak about that here. I want to talk a little bit about the story and about what would keep me interested for over 10 years, and talk a little bit about how I came across Karl von Frisch. In 2000, as Lisa mentioned, or she didn't say the date, but in 2000 I started the PhD program in history of science at Princeton. And about 2 years in, after I'd arrived, I'd finished all my coursework and I was starting to think about what I would write my dissertation on. I started reading widely. I had finished courses, exams, and my hope was to find a project that I could really fall in love with, something that would really sustain me. And when you do that, there's a few things that you want, or that I wanted as I was looking for a topic. One of the things I knew I wanted to write something about animals. I had written a master's thesis on Darwin's theory of sexual selection. I had become very interested in what that theory demanded of animals, specifically of female animals, right? In sexual selection, female animals have to make very careful deliberations, and they have to choose their mates according to very subtle aesthetic differences. And then they have to also refuse certain mates, right? They can't just mate indiscriminately, but they actually have to withhold mating. So that was a very demanding challenge that Darwin had set to female animals to explain these crazy adaptations like the peacock's tail, right? These adaptations that really make no sense under natural selection. So I wanted to work on the animal-human boundary and where scientists place that boundary, what they did to protect the boundary, how they decided you could cross the boundary, so what was legitimate to project from the human world onto the non-human animal world, and what kinds of methods should be employed to interrogate that boundary. The other piece that I wanted was to work on German-speaking Europe. I lived in Switzerland until I was 14, in the German-speaking part of Switzerland. So that's my first language, and I wanted my research to be in German. So I was looking for a topic about German-speaking Europe, and I wanted the sources to be undiscovered and allow me to talk about something that nobody else had done. So a big part of writing a professional historical project really is being able to find a source that lets you tell a story that you can't just get from published sources. And then the final piece, and the very important piece, is I wanted the science to be very good. I knew I was going to spend a lot of time looking at the science, and as a historian of science, you really push up against it, and that's only fun when the science is good. So those were the criteria that I used to set out, and I started reading different histories about animal behavior studies, history biology, and I was kind of casting about hoping to find something. And then I came across a description of the 1973 Nobel Prize. This was the Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine, and it was won by 3 people. And this is an excerpt of the New York Times announcing the Nobel Prize dated October 12th. It has a little print mark up there, which you can just ignore. But I talked about 3 behavioral science pioneers who win a Nobel Prize for medicine in the field of ethology. Ethology was the European approach to animal behavior that allowed for instincts and that wanted to give biological explanations of instincts. And ethologists also were not real comfortable with studying animals in the lab, right? A lot of American behavioral scientists ran a lot of rats through mazes and did that kind of controlled work. These European scientists really wanted to study animals in their natural habitat. So they wanted to see how they behaved in their environments. So 3 guys win the Nobel Prize. The first one was Konrad Lorenz. He was Austrian-born scientist. Second one was Karl von Frisch, that's my guy, also born in Vienna, also Austrian. And then the third one was Nico Tinbergen of the Netherlands. So these 3 won the prize together and they shared it. I want to draw your attention very briefly to this picture right here. So you can see that the story is about all 3, but the insert is these curious figures of the bees. And I'm actually not surprised that that's what they put in there, because when I started to read up more about this, it was really this image that sucked me in. I was taken by how elegant it was, how simple it was, and how much information, how much of Karl von Frisch's theory is encapsulated in that image. So I'm going to walk you through and explain quickly how it works. And some of you may remember this from your science classes, because it really is taught widely, and it is still something that people talk about. So Karl von Frisch described 2 different kinds of dances. Today, bee researchers talk about one dance, the one on the right, the waggle dance, but at the time he felt that he saw 2 different kinds of dances and that they gradually transitioned one into the other. So the dance on the right, he said, was what bees dance. They go out and they forage, they find a profitable food source, they come back into the hive and they run what's called a circle dance if the forage is less than 100 meters from the hive. On the right-hand side was what he called the waggle dance. The waggle dance is what the circle dance transitioned into at about 100 meters, and that was for food sources that were further away, and the waggle dance indicated the distance and direction of food sources to hive mates. So let me show you another image just to show you a little bit more how this works. So I'm actually going to step in front of it. The part that you see in the middle, labeled ST, that's the hive. And then you can see up here on the top right is the sun. Okay, so the way this theory works, this is the waggle dance. Bees indicate the direction of food sources with respect to where the sun is when they fly out to a food source. So in the first case, when it flies to 1, Roman numeral 1, the bee flies straight ahead and the sun is ahead, right? So when the bee comes back, this bottom part shows what the bee does back in the hive. When the bee comes back to the hive, she runs her waggle dance this way and waggles on the vertical. Then if the bee, let's look at number 2, goes from the hive to food source number 2, she makes an 80-degree angle with the sun. When the bee is back at the hive, she transposes that 80-degree angle with the vertical of the hive and runs the straight run portion of her waggle dance 80 degrees from the vertical. And then the final case is number 3, and you can see that that is directly opposed to the sun, and there the arrow goes down, and it's again aligned with the vertical. So that was what Karl von Frisch discovered. This is what he got his Nobel Prize for. He also said that the frequency of turns, the speed with which the bee runs these waggle dances, correlates with the distance of a food source. So the closer food, the more quickly the bee runs her circle dance. In the Nobel lecture, when Karl von Frisch won his Nobel Prize, he was actually 87 years old. He was too old to pick up the prize himself, so he sent his son. But in the lecture, he talks about the experiments that he did in order to determine the distance and direction indication. And he talks about how he sets up these fan experiments, he trains the bees to feed at one site, and then he observes where the bees land. He has observers at different stations, and they count how closely to the direction that the bee was trained to the recruits fly to. The same with distance. He has them set up in a vertical or in a straight line at different distances. He trains them to one site, and then he watches, and he has colleagues watch at different distances from the hive, and he sees how well the recruits use that information. So it's a story that is very elegant, it's very simple, and when I read about it, I thought it was very compelling. I decided to read more about Karl von Frisch. I read his scientific papers, I read his books, I read his autobiography, and I was very struck by the beauty of his science. I was able to get all those things at Princeton University. I was able to get the things that weren't there through interlibrary loan, but I knew that these published sources would only get me so far. And I knew that the published sources would let me tell one kind of story, and that was this very elegant story. And the way he narrated his discoveries was very much an intellectual story. It really was about sort of from one discovery to the next, as though he was hopping across stepping stones to where he ended up. So what I wanted to do is get a little bit messier. I wanted to tell a richer story, and I hoped a story that would be a little bit more interesting and that would get to why it was this man who made this discovery. Because here's the thing, there was a paradox that I came across, and that was people had observed the bee dances. Aristotle in the 4th century BC talks about how the bees run these curious figures in the hive. Beekeepers had for centuries talked about how honeybees seem to communicate with each other, right? The hive is a very complex situation. You have division of labor, it seems like collectively there are decisions being made. People for centuries talked about the political organization of the hive, right? They talked about the monarchy, they talked about the commune, they read political organization into the hive, and they looked to the hive for instruction for how a well-run polity might function. So you have people observing the figures that the bees run, you have people speculating about communication, but Karl von Frisch is the person who put together these two pieces, who said it was about communicating, about foraging sites, and it was the dances, and really unpacked it. But I wanted to know more, and I figured that this intellectual piece that he offered in his Nobel Prize lecture and his autobiography was only part of it. So I did a little bit of digging, and I wanted to know whether Karl von Frisch had left behind any kinds of unpublished papers. And I found that the University of Munich had actually received a collection of his papers. So I was curious about these papers. I wrote an email to, sorry, not the university, the State Library in Munich. I wrote an email to the State Library and I said, I'd like to come see these papers. Is there anything there? And they said, yes, we have these papers. Feel free to come, but we are just in the process of working them up. So they were just processing them. I went in 2002 in the summer. I went for just a few weeks, and they showed me what they had. And it was really a remarkable collection. They had lab notebooks, they had letters, personal letters, letters to institutions, they had reading notes, they had travel diaries, they had official university correspondence, and they had documents like old passports and things like that. So really his papers they had given to the State Library in Munich. But they were also, because they hadn't been processed yet, they said, you know, you can look at what we have, but we have to process it basically as you go along. So I went for 2 weeks, I saw what they had, and then I went back for a year, and then I will go back intermittently. When I was there for that year, they were actually processing the material while I was working on it. And it was kind of remarkable to see what that involved, right? Part of it was, and this is also something I think here that we talk about at the library, when you get personal papers, part of it is that you have to make it so that people can see what's there. You have to have some kind of intellectual control over that material, but you also want to maintain the order of how that person thought of their papers, right? You learn a lot by how people sort their papers and keep them, and I'll get to that in just a moment. This actually has relevance to the talk that I'm giving. So I knew that the papers were beautiful. I knew that this would definitely sustain a dissertation project at the very least. It sustained the book as well. And I was, you know, on my way. That's the State Library in Munich. It's a lovely building. I spent a lot of time there. Okay, so the other thing, there's just one more thing I want to say is, because they were working up the materials, basically simultaneous to me being there, the other thing that was really very nice about that is that I knew that nobody had been able to spend any sustained time in these papers. I knew I was the first person to really get to spend an extended amount of time with the papers, and that's really exciting. And the papers themselves, you know, the letters, there were letters there that Karl von Frisch had written in kind of his kiddie cursive script to his dad about his parakeet. And then there were diary entries written a week before he died. So truly, and he was 96 when he died. So really a very sustained engagement with somebody else's life. And that's the piece that I want to have come across as well, right? It is the elegant science and the compelling science, but it is also this person who did it. And there's ways in which that's relevant, right? We're not just looking at that because it's interesting, but it is in fact relevant to the science. So let me back up then a little bit and talk to you about Karl von Frisch. Let me introduce who I met while I was doing my reading and in these papers. Here's Karl von Frisch. He's just a little toddler. He was born in 1886 in Vienna. He was the fourth son, he had 3 brothers, of a wealthy Viennese family. His father was a very successful physician, and his mother, Marie Exner, came from a very well-connected Viennese family. Marie's had 3 brothers. Her 3 brothers, they were orphans, but they all went on to get a university education. They all became professors. So Karl von Frisch, little Karl, was in very good company as he was growing up, a really very vibrant intellectual environment. He was the baby of the family, and he also was very much indulged. You can see him here with his lovely toys. Aside from these stuffed toys, he had many, many animals. So from a very young age, he became interested in animals, and his family let him accrue hundreds of animals. Okay? Here's a slightly later picture. This is his uncle, Sigmund Exner. This is his mother's brother. And he was a physiologist at the University of Vienna. And von Frisch would actually go on to study with him. But you can see even before, he had a close relationship with him, and he was being mentored in science. This collection, by the way, is a collection that Karl von Frisch put together. He started it as a teenager. And if you travel to the very beautiful, picturesque little town of Brunwinkel in Austria, it's in the Salzkammergut, they still have this collection. So the City Museum has taken, a couple of years ago I went to visit it, the City Museum is now taking care of this collection. In 1905, von Frisch entered the University of Vienna to study medicine. 1905, we're talking turn of the century Vienna. Vienna is a vibrant, cosmopolitan place. We're talking Klimt, Mahler, Loos, Freud. All these currents are going on in this city. And the von Frisches were really tied into the literary and intellectual circles during this time. As part of his medical training, he studied physiology with his uncle. That's his uncle Sigmund, like I said. And he loved it. He loved the work. What he loved less was the clinical work that the medical training brought on more and more. He really didn't like it. He wanted to work with animals, and he didn't want to be a doctor. But his father had convinced him that being a doctor would secure him a good future. 3 years later, he took his exams and decided he was done. He went to Munich to study zoology with Richard Hertwig, who is one of the most revered figures of 20th century zoology. And he started to work on how pigment changes in compound eyes of invertebrates like moth and shrimp function. And if you think about the vertebrate eye, we have a pupil that will constrict and will regulate the amount of light that goes into the eye. And invertebrate compound eyes don't have that feature, so they have pigments that move and regulate light influx. So that was one of his first projects that he worked on. And then he went on to study pigment changes in fish. This is a minnow, and he severed the nerves, and he observed how the fish darkened anterior to the cut nerve. And in the case of fish, when the pigment cells relax, when the nerve is cut, the pigment can go to the surface and the fish turns dark. As he was working on fish, and color changes of fish, he came across a dispute that was happening. It was a dispute about whether or not certain animals possessed color vision. And there was a well-established scientist, he was 26 years older than Karl von Frisch, by the name of Karl Hess, who claimed that fish and bees and many other animals did not possess color vision. Now, von Frisch was just starting out in his career, but he observed the many different colors that minnows are able to take on, and he was a devoted Darwinist and believed in evolution, and it made no sense to him that fish would be able to change into all these different kinds of colors, but wouldn't be able to perceive color, right? And a lot of the color changes also have to do with mating. So he was skeptical of this claim. He started working on fish, and then as he got more into that work, he decided to try a new organism, which was the honeybee. It was the same problem. He was skeptical that bees couldn't see color if flowers, or since flowers, bloomed in so many different kinds of colors. Again, he was a Darwinist, and he believed that flowers or plants and their pollinators had co-evolved. So what is the point of the flowers having all these colors when their pollinators can't see them? So that is what got von Frisch interested in bees. Here is one of his sort of classic experiments. He does this in the late 19-teens, early 1920s, and this really sets the foundation for so much of his work that he does. So let me explain what this is. It was, you see the blue square right here, and those little specks, it's kind of hard to see, but those are actually bees congregating on the blue speck. So what he did is, to show that bees can recognize the color blue, he would feed them honey on a blue piece of paper. Then he would get rid of the honey, and he would put out an array of gray shades with the blue and see whether or not the bees could actually recognize. So what you see here, actually, there's no food here. He still has the little watch glasses on there, but there's no food. So the question was, would the bees be able to recognize the color, the hue, or would they just congregate on the same shade? So would they just be able to see light and dark? And then he took a photograph, and in this visually statistical way, he showed that bees, in fact, can see color. And it's actually kind of neat. When you look at this journal, it's all black and white. The whole journal is black and white, but there are these little squares of color for his experiments. So this work, where he was doing this conditioning, right? Conditioning to a stimulus, and then proving that animals are capable of more than what was previously believed, became his stock in trade. That is much of his work that he did. So in this dispute with von Hess, they did a lot of back and forth in journals, and it got fairly heated. Actually, his mentor told him to kind of tone it down a little bit. He thought it was sort of disrespectful to talk this way about somebody who was more established. But something happened. Rather than von Frisch, this hampering his progress, and he admitted this in his autobiography, it really helped to launch his career. This really, it made him very productive. It made him very vigilant. He very carefully tried to anticipate what objections von Hess would have. And it gave him exposure. So people heard about it. They heard about this dispute. This young guy, this young upstart, is taking on Karl Hess, this well-established director of the Munich Eye Clinic. So it really helped him kind of launch his reputation. And so things are looking very good. We're now moving into the 1920s. And he gets his first professorship in 1921 in Rostock, which is far north on the Baltic Sea. And then in 1923, he gets a second professorship in Breslau. In 1924, he founds a journal, right? Another sign that you've arrived professionally. And this is the Zeitschrift für vergleichende Physiologie. And we actually have this journal at the Linda Hall Library. And I have it here. We have that very first volume that is pictured right there. So I was very happy when I came to see that. So von Frisch starts this journal together with a colleague, Alfred Kuhn, who's a very well-established scientist, and they have a platform now to talk about comparative physiology. There's students published in this journal, and Karl von Frisch publishes a lot of his own work in it as well. Then in 1925, von Frisch lands a major coup. He gets the professorship in Munich that Hertwig, his mentor, his teacher, had had. So he gets a professorship in Munich after Hertwig retires, and he gets to run the Zoological Institute there. He has a lot of students, he grows the lab, he and his students publish in that journal, like I said, and he really establishes himself as one of the most promising scientists in Germany. Another very auspicious thing happens during this time. He is able in the late 1920s to early 1930s, he gets into conversation with a representative of the Rockefeller Foundation, the American Rockefeller Foundation. A visitor comes to his lab and walks through the institute in Munich, and von Frisch somewhat jokingly asks for money to build a new institute. And this guy says, sure, put in an application for it. So von Frisch writes up an application, and the Rockefeller Foundation actually builds him an institute. And this institute is exquisite. And von Frisch has a hand in every single aspect of its planning. It has temperature-controlled rooms. It has outdoor aquatic ponds. It has indoor aquatic rooms. It has below-ground rooms that keep a certain temperature. It has microscopy rooms. It has apartments for visiting researchers. It has a kitchen where everybody can congregate. It has a room where you can do media culture. It's another room where the very sensitive balances are kept. Like, we are talking beautiful. So everything, and this is an image of the library. Everything is going very well. In the winter break of 1932, he moves into his new lab, and things are great. Except it's December of 1932 in Munich, and things are not good. They are far from good. In January 1933, as is well known, Adolf Hitler gets sworn in as Chancellor of the German Reich. And Munich, not even before 1933, right, even before this happens, is really a city that's convulsing with these Nazi impulses. There are students. Students are especially aggressive and especially early agitators. They are agitating against Bolsheviks, against Jews. They bristle against the terms of the Treaty of Versailles. And Munich really is the center of the movement. Right? This is where it happens, and Hitler very proudly calls it that. Then in April of 1933, the law for the restoration of the professional civil service is established. And that is a law, this was one of the first things that Hitler does, and it was an effort to purge the civil service of anyone whom they found suspect or whom they didn't want or thought would be of questionable loyalty. So everybody in the civil service had to provide documentation that they were of Aryan descent. Von Frisch fills out his forms where it says grandparents, he puts in Roman Catholic, Roman Catholic, Roman Catholic. He sends it off, and things seem to be fine. Except, and this is what I see as I go through the archival records, right? The university, I'm not just spending time at the Stabi in Munich, I'm also looking at the university's records. And in von Frisch's personnel files, over the 30s and 40s, papers and documents start to pile up of people denouncing him. So in the background, there are questions about his Aryan descent, and people speculate about the Exners and talk about how there may be a Jewish grandparent in Karl von Frisch's pedigree. Students, at the same time, one of the things I found, which was one of the more chilling things, in the student newspaper, they published an article about this so-called bee expert who talks about the Volk and cares greatly about the bee folk, but when he's asked about the German folk, he has nothing to say. They don't mention him, but there's this kind of constant agitation. And it really is this kind of like, so-and-so knows somebody who was in the army who said that the Exners, blah, blah. And in one of the denunciation letters, there's even a list of people whom this person thinks will be more qualified to replace von Frisch. So these kinds of documents start to pile up. In 1937, they are required to once again prove their Aryan descent. He and his brother are corresponding, trying to find documentation to prove that the maternal grandmother is in fact Aryan, and they're unsuccessful. So von Frisch puts a little paper in with his application that says that there is some question about his maternal grandmother. He sends it off, nothing happens. He keeps his job, things progress. Then in late 1940, and this is a document from the university archive, and you see the date, it's just right before Christmas Eve, 23rd of December, 1940, you can just see somebody kind of dashing it off and going off. There is a letter to the president of the university, and it says, in regards to Professor von Frisch, and it says, is after the determinations of the Reichsministry of Education, a hybrid, a second degree crossbreed. So that was the designation for somebody who was a quarter Jewish. The Minister for Science, Education, and Volksbildung intends, according to paragraph 72 of that German law of the restoration of the civil service, to put Karl von Frisch into retirement. So that's the euphemism. So the letter was by CC. This is very German. In the German files, everybody's noted who gets it, where it goes, and there's copies all, like, it's meticulous. Here it says that it's going to be sent to his home address in Munich. It's also going to be sent to the dean of the natural sciences faculty, and then it's going to be sent to the leader, and this was a very virulent anti-Semitic group. This is the leader of the university lecturers, and this was a super fervent group that became more and more powerful in terms of determining who could get work and who couldn't in the academy. So this is devastating news for Karl von Frisch. This really is somebody who lives for his work. He is still young. And when I say this, and when I tell this story, and when I wrote my book, I do it always understanding that there were people who fared far, far worse, right? We keep that kind of relative peace in mind. For von Frisch's case, he started a desperate effort to keep his work. And that's what I investigate in the book. And this is when I talked about the archival materials and how archivists try to keep together how people keep their papers. It was when I was in Munich doing my research, there was a folder in von Frisch's papers that was all his other correspondences kind of by whom he's corresponding with. So it'll be the person, the name, and back and forth. This folder was all of his efforts to keep his job. So there were letters in there were telegrams in there were documents he filled out. It was all together in that folder. And when I found that folder, because in his autobiography, von Frisch is very tight-lipped about how he's able to keep his job, right? And for obvious reasons, if somebody has enough pull to help you during the Nazi period, you don't want to mention that in the post-war period because that's not something to brag about in the post-war period. So he does not talk about who helps him. He just says that it's somebody who has connections who helps him. In this folder, though, you have all this correspondence, and I think, my God, it's like a gift. Right? It's all there. And then I think about it and I realize it kind of is a gift. And it was left there on purpose for me or somebody like me, right? So he knew that somebody would be writing his story and he put together all these papers and he left them. So on the one hand, it's an incredibly excellent source to tell this story. But on the other hand, I also know it's a very curated story, right? And there are probably pieces in this pile as well that have been pulled out. It's a little bit like if you were doing archaeology and you came into a tomb and there were carefully curated things and maybe some treasures. And maybe you would also like to dig through a latrine or a garbage dump and get at that other kinds of stuff, right? But so I had these documents, and that is really at the heart of my book for how he navigates the bureaucracy and how this worked. These are the sources I use. So let me tell you a little bit more about that. Von Frisch writes to people, he gets to work on this right away, and he writes to people who he thinks are going to have pull in high up places in the Nazi bureaucracy. So one of the first people he writes to is a person by the name of Hans Spemann, who's a very well-known biologist who had in fact won a Nobel Prize. So he asks him to put in a good word for him, and he in fact does. He writes to the Ministry of Education. But in this pile of documents, it becomes clear that this is a very touch and go situation. It's very uncertain. We also learn that von Frisch travels to Berlin trying to figure out exactly what it is that they have. And he finds out that they in fact have the baptismal records, church records, not of his grandmother, but of her parents, and that they got baptized shortly before she was born. And of course, that is what a lot of people did in the 19th century in order to be assimilated, in order to be professionals. They converted to Catholicism, and in the Nazi period then, people were again declared Jewish who hadn't really thought of themselves as Jewish. Von Frisch did not think of himself as Jewish, but because the Nazi conception of Judaism was about blood, overwhelmingly, that's what happens. So von Frisch travels to Berlin. In these documents, I had his handwritten notes of the meetings and the people he talked to. He gets an extension. They want him to respond, but he actually is able to get an extension. We can also tell something from these documents about the strategy that he used. And this tells us something about not just von Frisch, but about science under National Socialism. Early on, like I said, he targets people who he thinks will have the most pull, people he thinks are famous. But then we see a shift. And he moves to people who are far less illustrious than the first people he targets, but people who are of a more practical persuasion. So one of the people who writes on his behalf is the president of the Bavarian Beekeepers Association. Another person who writes on his behalf is Bernhard Schriemek. And Bernhard Schriemek is somebody who was a vet, so did not have the academic credentials that Karl von Frisch had, but he was in the Ministry of Food and Agriculture. And actually in the post-war period, Schriemek becomes a TV personality, and he has a show about animals, and a zoo show that is very popular in the post-war period. So Schriemek is able to help push his case along. And then we learn in this pile of documents that it actually is working. First, he's told that he can continue doing his research after he retires. And then in July of 1942, this document says that in consultation with the leader of the party chancellery, I have decided to stop the pursuing of putting him into retirement until the end of the war. So this really gives von Frisch not just the ability to continue doing his work, but they say they're not going to touch him until after the war. And von Frisch ends up doing work despite being a quarter Jewish. He does it with funding from the Nazi Ministry of Food and Agriculture. And amazingly, he does the work that then earns him a Nobel Prize in 1973 during World War II. It's crazy. How does that happen? Why does that happen? We learn that in this folder, one of the things that survives are the talking points of one of these meetings. And it turns out that the reason why von Frisch is able to do this is that in the early 1940s, there was a bee plague. There was a flare-up of Nosema apis, which is something that beekeepers still deal with today, but at certain times it really flares up. It's this microsporidium that has just been reclassified as a fungus, but that affects bees and they die, not like in colony collapse disorder, but they will die with diarrhea around the hive, and it's very obvious that that's what they have. So the bees are dying then, as at other times. And Germany is reminded of the fact that it depends on its main pollinators, right? And by this time, Germany's war wasn't going to be quick. The Blitzkrieg was done. It was not going to happen. And it was embroiled in a grinding war of attrition. And food politics were critically important to the German war effort, even before this time. After World War I, the narrative about why World War I had been lost was because of the British blockade. It was because of food, because Germans were starving. So as Hitler was violating the terms of Versailles and was gearing up for war, food politics was part of that right from the beginning. So this all comes together. So one of the things that von Frisch did is in the 1940s, in the early 1940s, once it starts to be clear that he may run into problems, he starts to really retool his work. Remember the squares that I showed you with the honeybees recognizing color, right? That those experiments of can bees see color, he did more of that work. It was can bees smell different odors, right? If flowers have beautiful smells, then probably bees are able to discern odors. So he worked on colors, on sense of smell, on sense of taste, very classical physiological problems, right? Nothing practical really about that. Like these are really intellectually driven problems that he was interested in. Well, in the early 1940s, he totally retools and he really starts to tackle this practical problem of the dying bees. And this was a stretch. He knew a lot about bees, but he really knew nothing about the bee plague. So he turns his lab around and he starts working on this problem. And at the same time, and this is what I was talking about, in the documents, he also starts turning to more practical people, right? It really shifts. And this is something that I think historians are really changing the narrative about science under National Socialism. We used to think of science under National Socialism as being only the kind of most racially motivated, crudest, kind of most pathetic sciences, right? But at the same time, and that the theoretical sciences totally suffered. A good example is German physics, which was a sort of crude reaction to Einsteinian physics. But in fact, there is quite a bit of theoretical science that continues to flourish in Nazi Germany. And there are also practical or applied sciences that we would consider largely innocuous, like plant and animal breeding, but that were also very well supported and were part of the German war effort, right? Because they were fighting a war of food and a war of attrition. These kinds of sciences were well supported. So that's the kind of historiography that's being reevaluated and that my book also speaks to. In 1942, I'll get back to his story. In 1942, shortly after he gets his reprieve, he asks for permission to expand his research. And he also wants to work on crop pollination. Again, it's a very practical problem. He's been allowed to work on the bee plague, and now he's also given permission to work on that. And that work is published in 1947 under an Austrian publisher, and it's called Duftgelenkte Bienen im Dienste der Landwirtschaft und Imkerei, and that means bees that are led through scents for agriculture and beekeeping. And this is another book. I'm actually not going to dig it out because it's really buried under here. It's another book we have in the Linda Hall Library collection. And you can see it was published in 1947, and the Linda Hall Library acquired it in 1949. And the Linda Hall Library was 3 years old, just a mere toddler. And this kind of a book was acquired by the library, this very practical book on agriculture. So I'm going to get things to the end. Why do I care about this kind of book? This book, during its time, besides the fact that the Linda Hall Library purchased it, it actually never got that much attention. The work that von Frisch did on increasing visits by bees to crops, he talked about it later how this worked, and in fact it was more successful than his work on the bee plague, but nobody really picked it up. It really didn't cause the kind of resonance, or it didn't make the impact that he felt it deserved to have. And part of the reason, I think, is that one of the things that happens in this book is that it contains, aside from these crops where he's able to increase yield, like clover and barley and things like that, it actually also contains this image. So this is another place where Karl von Frisch talks about the honeybee dance language. And the reason why it's in this book on agricultural practices is because, in fact, it was during this work on crop pollination, during World War II, with funding from the Nazi Ministry of Food and Agriculture, that Karl von Frisch made this discovery. So he's training bees to pollinate fields, and he's training them to feed really far away, and as he's in the hive observing them, he notices how the direction of the bees' dances indicates where he was training them. So that, to some extent, is why I care about this book. But I care about this book because it precisely unsettles this kind of story, right? I could tell an intellectual story that just talked about one discovery after another, but the reason why von Frisch was able to make this discovery is for a host of reasons. He was able to do it after he was declared a quarter Jewish. He was working in Germany. It was during World War II, and there was a bee plague. And that's the kind of rich contextual story that I think we miss when we just focus on the intellectual piece. And it really helps us to understand how it is that people were situated in their culture, in their society, and what kinds of things that they were struggling with, that they were encountering as they formulated their theories. It was also what allowed the bees to undergo a really vast journey over the course of the 20th century. I'd hinted briefly to the fact that bees had long been looked at, not just by naturalists, but also by economists, by political theorists, by poets, by literary people, to talk about how the society of the bees interacted, right? The moral authority of the hive had been consulted for centuries. Over the course of the 20th century, that's something that's really pushed out of science, right? It is no longer okay to say the bees are angry or they're emotional or they love their queen and look how wise the queen is, right? That just doesn't cut it anymore. So as the bees are studied over the course of the 20th century, in von Frisch's work, we see a transformation that happens. They start out as a largely physiological animal, and then in the post-war period, they become the most studied form of non-human communication, right? This is really a sensation that an animal as lowly as an insect, a honeybee, can communicate about distance and direction with its hive mates. And it is this kind of scientific distance and objectivity that scientists were very proud of over the course of the 20th century. And I think the intellectual achievement is clear. But I also think, as we once again think about the bees and we think about pollinator health, we're reminded once again that, in fact, we're not separate from these animals, right? That we and the bees are very much entwined and that our fates are deeply linked. Thank you.
All right, we have time for a few questions. Before we begin the book signing, raise your hand. I'll come by with a microphone. We're live streaming and videotaping, so we'll want to get the audio of your question.
Hi.
Hi, Allie.
Fabulous talk. How does one train bees, and was von Frisch the first to do so?
Yes, excellent question. So the question was, how do you train bees, and whether he was the first person to do it. The way he did it, and he describes it, is that, and he was not the first person to do it, the way you do it is that you go by the hive with a piece of paper smeared with honey, and you wait until the bees settle, and then you take a step back. And then you wait until more bees come, and you take another step back. And you basically do it that way. And what he would do is that he would start off with honey, and the bees would come to the piece of paper with honey, and as he got to the site where he wanted to do his experiments, he would switch to sugar solution so that odor would not contaminate the experiments. Yeah.
Any other questions? Yes, sir.
Yeah, knowing how crowded a beehive is and how someone, one bee would have to see this dance to know where it was, and how many bees have to go to this food. Did only the bees that saw the dance know where to go, or did some bees see the dance and then put out, hey, I know where it is, follow me, and other bees followed that bee to the food?
So that is a great question, and that is a question that people ask to Karl von Frisch, right? How do we know that the bees are actually recruited and that the bees are not following out? But just let me actually back up quickly. Your first question was about, do all the bees know, right? It is the bees that follow the dancing bee, and there's a few that will surround the dancing bees. So if you're an experimental scientist and you want to know whether or not the bees follow each other, one way to do it is to observe the bee dancing and watch the bee. And by the way, von Frisch had this amazing bee numbering. That's actually on the cover of my book. The little dots allowed von Frisch to number hundreds of bees. So he was able to individuate the bees and keep track of them in his lab notebooks by this little number. I mean, it's so simple and beautiful. But what he did is he watched the bees around. He could tell which numbers were attending the bees' dances, and then he would take the dancing bee and he would kill it. So that is the way that you make sure that you get naive bees, right? Yeah. I know, it all seems very sweet, and he's in fact killing a lot of bees in his experiments.
Did he solve the problem of the plague that was killing the bees?
No, that work, in fact, was inconclusive. So the work that he was much more sad, and it's interesting actually to read his reports, because of course it is very much in his interest to talk about how well this work is going. But in fact, that is not the work after the war that he talks about. He really talks about guiding bees to crops and how that increases crop yields, how it makes them more efficient. It's actually very interesting, the language about making the bees more efficient in the service of the Reich.
Another question over here. Do different types of bees communicate the same way?
So they had found that different kinds of bees actually have, different honeybees that do these dances actually have different dialects. So they will vary the speed slightly, and they'll vary their dances slightly. And one of von Frisch's students, Martin Lindau, who was really his kind of heir apparent, is the one who did this really lovely work on that. And the other thing he found out, and this is also really important, is that the language is not just used for foods. The distance and direction indication is also used when the bees are swarming and they're looking for new homes. So it's not just specific to food, it is also used for finding nest sites.
So von Frisch was he's a very committed experimentalist, but his survival in this situation depends on being able to get certain kinds of results. Is there any evidence that he felt the tension between trying to report things that he thought would be helpful to his cause against the things that he observed?
Well, that's kind of the sense I get. This is kind of what I was hinting at when I read the stuff on nosema, on the bee plague, and even a little bit in the agriculture. Like, there's a real kind of urge during the war in the publications to talk about progress, right? Because it's imperative that he shows that this is successful, even though after the war he says it wasn't really all that successful. So I definitely get that sense. And I also think it is, it is a remarkable story about how he retools his work while this is going on to be of such a practical orientation. And, Germany's not the only place, right, where people are doing war-relevant work, right? Other countries in conflict also support this kind of work, but he really shifts his lab, he shifts all his people, he shifts his resources. It's quite amazing.
Tania, we have a question in the middle of the room, and due to the time, and we need to start the book signing soon, so this will have to be the last question.
Did he study any other types of bees?
He studied only the honeybees. Yes, good question. He only studied honeybees. He studied other animals though, right? When you saw the fish. And he gave a lot of talks to school groups. And he would talk to kids about his work. And there's a letter in the archive where they say, oh, could you come and speak to us about the honeybees?
And he writes back, he's like, you know what, I've spoken to your classes so many times about the honeybees. Couldn't I come and talk to you about the fish? I've done really amazing work with fish. And they're like, no, come talk to us about the honeybees.
Well, what a wonderful lecture, Dr. Munz. And we will start the book signing with Rainy Day Books as soon as we can get over there. They have copies of the Dancing Bees for purchase and signing. And if you have questions or if you want to talk with Dr. Munz, buy a book and get in line. Thank you for attending tonight's event. I hope to see you this Saturday for our second Saturday event and September 22nd for our next exhibition opening. Thank you and good night.
Thank you.